When the tide is low and the light is leaning west, the Colonial Seaside Inn reveals itself in the way old things do. Not by shouting, but by settling into a shape the sea already understands. Timber, bleached and slow, takes on the same curve as the shore. A single shutter, half hung on a salt-stained hinge, begins to rattle in the pattern of a long-remembered knock. 2 slow taps, a pause, the same rhythm that might once have answered a weary sailor. Gulls ride the wind like thread on a spool. The air is all brine and soot, and a distant wood smoke that does not belong to the building anymore, yet somehow completes its silhouette. This place has a name on the maps: Colonial Seaside Inn. Waves and wind from the 18th century, and a character written into its beams. At dusk, a lamp is still set to take its place, and the way the last light finds the grain of the door tells you where someone once stood to watch for returning boats. Stand close and you hear the house speak in other tongues. The timber's slow creak that answers the swell, the whisper of wind through a loose sash, the small metallic cough of a hinge. These are not grand noises. They are the steady vocabulary of a building that has been attended to, and then, for a time, left to listen. If these stories of place and memory speak to you, subscribe. It is thought the inn took root in the 18th century, when harbors were mapped by sound as much as by sight, and shelter for the traveling came by the measure of a hearth rather than a ledger. In those first years, the innkeeper, the name lost to indefinido, kept a routine that made the house recognizable to every passing tide. At dusk, a lamp was trimmed and lifted into its bracket. A coal bed was raked where the hearth claimed the cold air. A whistle, short and alto, announced supper. The keeper's hands learned the building's small resistances: oil for the hinges, a driver for a nail that would not sit, a handkerchief rubbed over a table where salt had found its way in. These were ordinary acts. Repeated, they became the architecture's memory. Imagine a winter evening when the harbor was a bruise, and rain stood in the air like a promise of more. A weary crew hauled their soggy boots over the threshold, cheeks washed clean by the sea. The keeper moved among them with the certainty of one who understands how to make strangers less alone. Porridge, ale, a dry blanket folded at the foot of a cot. There would have been a child, perhaps the keeper's own, adding a small, deliberate noise to the room: the scrape of a wooden spoon against the side of a mug, or the quiet counting of knots on a length of rope. Outside, a gale might heave at the shingle. Inside, the lamp's wick kept time with the hearth's soft insistence. Those tiny rituals, lighting, setting, listening, made the place recognizable to both people and the sea. The inn learned to answer the wind in the way a person learns to reply to a beloved voice. Over years, the routines stitched themselves into stories. A chipped mug found beneath a floorboard might bring back, in a single look, the sweep of a woman's skirt, or the knuckled hand of a fisherman who favored the window seat. A ledger page, browned at the edges and careless in its script, lists arrivals whose names have long gone to nothing. Even so, the scrawled entries have weight. A single entry, an abbreviated date, the mark of a man who could not sign, becomes an echo chamber where entire rooms are reconstructed in the mind. These objects are small anchors. They make the inn recognizable across absence. There were regulars: a sailor who favored the northern stool and always asked for his drink without sugar; a midwife who came with oil and calm hands when winter births were overdue; a teacher home on leave who read from a book so quietly that conversation around him softened. They are not famous. They are the ordinary keepers of a social map. Each arrival left a trace: a palm smear on the counter, a knot of fishing twine tucked beneath a table leg, a child's chalk drawing at the back of the pantry. These traces do not require history books to prove their worth. They are acts that build the habit of a place, habit that teaches the shutters when to fall and the kettle when to sing. That ritual, repeated at dusk, became a map. Time, merciless in its indifference and gentle in its forgettings, changes the rhythm of such houses. The inn did not close in any dramatic single hour recorded by a chronicle. Rather, absence accumulated like dust. Perhaps trade shifted, indefinido, so boats that had once leached close to the quay found other channels. Perhaps a storm took a scarped seam and left work too costly for the owner. Perhaps the keeper grew old and left without an apprentice. The reasons are multiple and uncertain. What matters is the sensation of a place that had been expected to be there, and then was silent. With silence, the smaller sounds became all the more clear. Inside, the lamp that used to be lifted at dusk hung empty and bent. The hearth kept its outline of ash, but no hand stirred it. At low tide, the sea left a damp ring along the foot of the steps where no new boot scuff marred the wood. Cobwebs traced the inner corners, and a moth, finding itself in a new quiet, learned to live on the stillness. The shutter that once rattled like a greeting now complained like an old throat, and the oil-stained thumb mark on the counter faded to a pale memory. Absence folds a room in on itself. The things that once circulated through it, voices, smells, the movement of cups, lay down and waited. Yet even in neglect the place is not quite dead. Elements remember what people forget. Waves keep their itineraries. Wind returns on a schedule older than any ledger. On certain nights, the sea will work itself into a soft insistence that flattens the silence so that the inn seems to answer back with a creak. Stones on the path remember where feet once trod. The stair-riser holds the wear of shoemaking through generations. It is possible to read those small abrasions as a history written in the language of wear. After a time, a new labor begins, not loud but resolute. A team might arrive, hands calloused from other jobs, or someone who knows the old carpentry instinctively, or volunteers who have come because they heard the inn's name spoken with an affection they could not ignore. They bring tools that sound unlike the ones the original keepers used. The hum of a modern sander is a foreign note for the timbers. The clean smell of new paint cuts across the older scent of coal and brine. These are unmistakable markers of present time. Where the earlier routine was made by domestic care, this restoration stitches together both craft and conscience. Restoration begins with patient gestures. A beam is lifted and tamped into place. A nail that once refused to sit is encouraged by a knowledgeable hand. Hinges are oiled until the old rattle becomes a controlled, deliberate sound once more. They sand away layers until the old grain returns. There is a quiet, almost of reverence in such work, as if the building's surface must be consulted rather than ordered. The team learns to read signs the way the first keeper did. A certain staining means where a leak has been. A pattern of rot tells where to splice. A faint char on a beam tells of hearths long tended. Years can fold a room in on itself. Habit unfolds it again. There are small discoveries that punctuate the labor. A chipped blue mug tucked beneath a joist, stubbornly held in dirt like a relic. A folded scrap of cloth that might once have been a child's handkerchief. A pressed leaf in the spine of a ledger. Each object insists on a story and asks for a careful translation. A page of accounts, once brittle, is smoothed and read aloud in a room that is otherwise noisy with planers and conversation. In that reading, the ghost of the inn's former days seems less like a specter and more like a blueprint. The keepers, present tense now, deliberate and modest, begin to relearn the old rhythms. They lift a lamp at dusk because it is right to do so, not for any ceremony. They oil hinges because the sound of a sticking door says disrespect to a house that has held so much life. The return to use unfolds in small theatrical moments. The first bread set in a rebuilt oven, the first kettle boiled until it sighs, the first chair dragged across the floor with a respectful creak. Each is a small return of voice. A night comes when the hearth is lit and the light makes a pool on the worn counter. Outside, the wind is an authority and does not always obey human desire, but tonight it seems to settle as if to hear what is being said. The first guest to come back is not announced with trumpets. Perhaps it is a local whose grandparents once lodged here. Perhaps a stranger whose eyes have the hunger for steadiness. The guest's hand on the counter mirrors those other hands that once steadied bowls and counted coins. For an instant, the gesture is a stitch joining two seams of time. There is a particular evening that serves as the inn's reunion. No ceremony, only a confluence of elements that turns into recognition. A storm has been pushing off the coast, and at low tide the sea spends itself in a tired, hush-like swell. Inside, the last of the workers has wiped his palms on his trousers and left a faint mark on the wood. The lamp is trimmed. The hearth throws a long, quiet heat. The newly mended shutter, which for weeks has been a good hum of timber and nail, finds in the wind the same cadence it used to. The gusts that might once have thrown the shutter into disarray now fold around it like a hand finding the shoulder of an old friend. There is a knock at the door, small, exact, and it is answered by a hand that has learned the old physiology of welcome. The wind and the waves seem to hush, and for a fleeting, honest second, the building acknowledges the presence of those who have taken it back into care. That moment, so simple it would be easy to miss, holds an intensity that quiets the room. It is not miraculous, and there is no trumpeted redemption. It is the intimacy of recognition, the building, human labor, and sea aligning in a common grammar. In that instant, the inn does not become alive as if for the first time. Rather, continuity is restored. The habits, the small reparative acts, the threads of community that run through hands and boards. People around the hearth exchange low conversation. The guest finds a seat and the kettle sings its small, ordinary song. Outside, the tide continues on its schedule, unconcerned and faithful. What is recoverable is not everything that was lost. Some stains cannot be unstitched. A certain tilt in a threshold may remain, a memorial of a day of wind and salt beyond mending. The memory of voices and the precise way a particular sailor laughed are particulars that will never be fully recovered. But there is substance enough in the habitual to make continuity plausible. The teaching of how to lift a lamp, the tuck of a blanket across a sleeping body, the slow, ethical labor of preserving rather than merely owning. Ethical stewardship insists on patience and humility. It is not a heroic conquest of time, but an admission that steadiness is itself a kind of courage. When we leave the inn after such an evening, the final glance back is not a picture postcard. It is a study in relations. The building has not been reduced to a curated exhibit. It hums with use, with the fitful, tender patterns of human life. The shoreline keeps its itinerant work. The waves, indifferent and ineradicable, continue to mark the stones as they always have. The wind still finds the same shudder in the same way, and knocks a language the building remembers. To stand there is to understand that memory is not only in the mind, it is in the oil on a hinge, in the worn curve of a step, in the way the light first catches a chip of paint. There is a hunger in public life for tenderness and continuity, a hunger that an inn like this meets quietly. It is not the grand narrative of monuments or national triumphs. It is the small, domestic ethic of care that sustains a community. To guard a ritual is to acknowledge that some things are worth the slow labor of keeping. Such guardianship moves in increments. 1 shilling spent on oak rather than on a cheaper board. 1 evening spent teaching a younger hand to splice. 1 refusal to allow weather to be the final editor of memory. The Colonial Seaside Inn. Waves and wind from the 18th century stands, therefore, as a kind of argument, that the steady repetition of small acts yields a recompense not counted in profit, but in recognition. A place may be quiet for a time. It may endure neglect. It may bear the marks of harsher days. Yet, when people return with attentive hands and the sea keeps its endless beat, the ordinary can be restored into something that holds us. This is not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It is a practical, moral insistence that tenderness matters. If you have a place that recognized you, whether it was a kitchen table, a bench by the river, or a lamp on a harbor wall, share that feeling with someone who needs to be reminded that small, repeated choices keep our world from fraying. Share this if a place has ever recognized you.